When death took her father, Amelia was left alone with the silence and the infinite prairie. Her rough hands gripped a rifle the day the rain brought a stranger to her door. In his blue eyes, worn by difficult roads, she recognized the same pain. That dwelled within her. Time, like well-worked earth, can yield unexpected fruits. Sometimes life is reborn in the place where we believed only ashes remained. If this story has touched your heart, leave your like as one who holds a hand in difficult moments. And tell us, how do you think this story of solitude and encounter ends? Your experience is a treasure worth sharing. The wind whistled through the tall grasses of the prairie, as if whispering ancestral secrets that only the earth could understand. Amelia Cartwright watched from the weathered porch of her cabin how the clouds cast fleeting shadows over the rolling hills of Wyoming. The spring of 1883 had arrived timidly, painting a tender green over what winter had left dormant. But for her, the colors remained muted, since the cold had taken her father. Silence was her only constant companion. A silence she had learned to breathe, to inhabit, to turn into refuge. Her rough hands, weathered by ceaseless work, held a cup of coffee that had already grown cold, like many of her hopes. At 28, Amelia had become a woman of precise gestures and watchful gazes. Isolation had not broken her. On the contrary, it had sculpted in her a resolve as firm as the mountains silhouetted against the horizon. That morning her eyes detected something unusual, a solitary figure on horseback approaching slowly from the west. Her heart quickened, as her legs carried her instinctively toward the cabin's interior. With movements practiced during long nights of solitude, she took her father's rifle, checked the load, and returned to the porch. The figure approached with the caution of one who knows they are being watched. The rider mounted an exhausted chestnut, horse whose head drooped slightly, revealing the fatigue of a long journey. Amelia adjusted the rifle against her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of metal and wood. The wind changed, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and new grass. In that moment, as the distance between her and the stranger shortened, Amelia felt a strange certainty within. That day marked an invisible frontier between all that had been and all that was yet to come. She aimed without hesitation. Her eyes, a deep brown inherited from her mother, narrowed as they focused on the intruder. In her mind, her father's warnings resonated like a litany. Kindness is a luxury we cannot always afford on this land. But she also remembered his softer words, those he whispered when he thought she was sleeping. Someday, Amelia, you'll find that true strength lies in knowing when to lower your weapon. The sun reached its zenith, and its relentless light revealed with greater clarity the stranger who now stopped at a prudent distance, as if he had received Amelia's silent message. Jonah Mercer raised his right hand in a universal gesture of peace, while with his left he firmly held the reins of his exhausted horse. Under the worn brim of his hat, clear and attentive eyes studied the woman who aimed at him from the porch. He showed no fear, only cautious respect for that invisible line he should not cross without permission. "I'm just looking for water for my horse, ma'am." His voice sounded like fine sand over stone worn by the road and silence. "I saw the smoke from your chimney from the hill and thought perhaps there might be someone who needed help." Amelia did not lower the rifle, but something in the simple sincerity of those words made her finger move slightly away from the trigger. She observed the man carefully. Tall, with broad shoulders marked by years of effort, face weathered by the sun and a several days' beard that couldn't hide a faint scar crossing his chin. His clothes, though dusty, were not those of a vagabond, and his eyes, of a blue faded by weather, held her gaze without challenge or submission. "I'm heading to Fort Laramie to trade pelts," he continued, gesturing toward his loaded saddlebags. "But my horse lost a shoe during the last storm. I don't intend to cause trouble." The wind stirred Amelia's dark hair, loose over her shoulders in a carelessness improper to her usual vigilance. A rebellious strand crossed her face, but she didn't allow herself to look away from the stranger to remove it. "There's a water trough behind the stable," she finally replied, her voice hoarse from little use. "How you can water your animal." Jonah nodded with a slight bow, almost imperceptible, and led the horse toward where she had indicated, keeping himself visible at all times, as if understanding that any sudden or unexpected movement might make that solitary woman reconsider her act of mercy. Amelia watched him from a distance, not abandoning her position. For the first time in months, another human being occupied space on her property, altering the immutable rhythm of her days. The sensation was strange, like awakening a muscle long asleep. As she watched the man attend to his mount with meticulous care, something in his measured and respectful movements reminded her of her father. The same economy of gestures, the same concentrated attention that turned a simple task into an act of devotion. When he finished and turned to her with the silent question of what he should do next, Amelia surprised herself by offering something she hadn't planned. "I have stew," she said, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. "If you're hungry." The crackling of the fire in the fireplace reached the porch like a distant melody, punctuating the silence that stretched between them. Seated at a prudent distance, with bowls of stew on their knees, Amelia and Jonah shared the first meal she had prepared for another human being since her father's death. "It's good stew," he commented after several spoonfuls, looking toward the horizon that was beginning to tinge with orange tones. "It's been a long time since I tasted home cooking." Amelia nodded, acknowledging the compliment without words. She observed how the man's hands, large and marked by small scars that spoke of years of hard work, held the spoon with surprising delicacy. "Do you live here alone?" Jonah finally asked after another prolonged silence. "My father died last winter," she replied, and the words, though brief, weighed like stones. "The land is mine now." Jonah nodded, capturing in that simple phrase all the determination and pain the woman didn't express directly. His eyes roamed the property, the cabin well-maintained despite its age, the repaired corrals, the small garden beginning to awaken with spring. Everything spoke of constant work, of a daily struggle against solitude and the elements. "It takes courage to maintain land like this," he said. And it wasn't an empty compliment, but an observation born from deep knowledge of what it meant to survive in those vast expanses, especially alone. Amelia looked at him directly for the first time since they had begun eating. She had expected to find in his eyes the pity she had so often seen in the town inhabitants when she went for supplies, but found only quiet respect, as if he understood perfectly what it meant to face immensity with nothing more than one's own hands and determination. "And you?" she asked, surprising herself with her own interest. "What brings you so far from any traveled road?" Jonah set his bowl aside and ran a hand through his incipient beard, a gesture Amelia interpreted as a way to buy time to order his thoughts. "Sometimes the loneliest roads are the only ones that make sense," he finally replied, with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been trading pelts for 3 years. Before that—" He paused, and Amelia perceived that some stories weighed too much to be shared with strangers. "Let's say I learned that a man can carry his most valuable possessions on a horse, but his true burdens he carries within." The sun finally set behind the mountains, leaving them in that ambiguous light of dusk that blurs contours and softens roughness. In that growing twilight, Amelia felt something within her loosen slightly, like a rope tensioned for too long. "You can spend the night in the stable," she offered, collecting her empty bowl. "There's fresh hay and blankets in the chest. Tomorrow you can continue on your way." Jonah nodded, thanking with a sober gesture. When he rose to retire, he seemed to want to say something more, but finally only inclined his head slightly and walked away toward the stable. Amelia watched him go, his silhouette outlined against the increasingly dark sky, and felt a strange and indefinable emotion, as if she had just turned a key in a lock that had been rusted for too long. Dawn arrived with the implacable clarity known only to highlands. Amelia awoke as always with the first rays of sun, but that day there was a subtle difference in the air, a presence that altered the familiar rhythm of solitude. She dressed with mechanical efficiency and went out to the porch to face the day. What she saw stopped her cold. Jonah, under the golden light of dawn, was splitting wood by the shed with rhythmic and precise movements. He had already formed a considerable pile, ordered with a care that revealed respect for others' belongings. He hadn't heard her come out, absorbed in the task he had imposed on himself without anyone asking. Amelia remained motionless, watching him. There was something hypnotic about the cadence of his movements, the way his body seemed to know exactly how much force to apply to each blow. When he finally saw her, Jonah stopped the axe mid-swing and nodded in greeting. "Good morning," he said simply. "I thought I'd show my gratitude for your hospitality before leaving." Amelia noticed he had already saddled his horse, which grazed peacefully near the stable. Everything indicated he was preparing to continue his journey as announced. "How you've cut enough wood for a week," she commented, crossing her arms in a gesture that hid certain discomfort at this unsolicited help. "Winter is barely retreating," he replied, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "And a warm stable is the best I've had in a long time." They looked at each other for a moment that seemed to stretch like the shadow of a tree at sunset. There was something unspoken floating between them, a question neither formulated. "The north fence has loose posts," Amelia finally said, surprising herself. "If you want to stay one more day, I could use your help, in exchange for food and shelter." Jonah studied her with a gaze that seemed capable of reading beyond her measured words. Then he nodded slowly. "One more day," he accepted. "Loose posts can bring problems when the spring storms come." So began a day that passed mostly in silence, but a silence different from what Amelia knew. This silence wasn't empty, but full of the other's presence, of the sounds of shared work, of hammer against wood, of sighs of effort, of the occasional whinny of the horse. At midday, while sharing hard bread and cheese in the shade of the barn, Jonah demonstrated an unexpected skill by calming the stubborn mule that always tried to bite Amelia when she got too close. "She's afraid," he explained, stroking the animal's neck with long, measured movements. "She doesn't bite from malice, but because she expects to be hurt first." Amelia watched how the mule, usually so skittish, inclined her head under the man's caresses, almost with abandon. "How did you know?" she asked, genuinely intrigued. Jonah shrugged, a gesture that seemed to diminish what for Amelia was extraordinary. "Sometimes we recognize in others what we carry within," he replied with simplicity. "This animal has been mistreated before. She bears the marks here." He pointed to some barely visible scars under the fur. "And here," he added, gently touching, the area between the animal's eyes, where a permanent crease spoke of years of tension and vigilance. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. Somehow she felt Jonah was also talking about her, about the invisible scars she carried, about the constant tension with which she faced each day. For the first time since her father died, she felt truly seen. That night, when stars already populated the sky like grains of salt on black velvet, Amelia made a decision that would alter the course of her days. "Planting season is approaching," she said while they gathered tools. "I could use help for a few more days, if you're not in a hurry to reach Fort Laramie." In the twilight's penumbra, she couldn't see Jonah's exact expression, but she caught the subtle change in his posture, an almost imperceptible loosening of the shoulders, as if something within him had found, at least temporarily, a place to rest. "Business can wait," he replied. "The land cannot." 3 days became a week, and the week began to stretch like the shadow of a tree as the sun descends. Jonah had built a small shelter beside the shed, a simple but personal space that marked a respectful boundary between his presence and Amelia's intimacy. Each morning, before she even awakened, he had already lit the fire in the outdoor kitchen and prepared coffee, a silent routine that neither mentioned but both were beginning to expect. They worked from sun to sun with the urgency of those who know nature doesn't wait. Together they planted the small wheat field that Amelia had tried to cultivate alone the previous year, only to see half the seeds lost for lack of sufficient hands. They repaired the cartwheel her father had left half-fixed when illness confined him to bed. They reinforced the chicken coop roof just before a spring storm that would otherwise have destroyed it. In those shared days, Amelia discovered that Jonah possessed knowledge she valued more than gold. He could read the sky and predict rains with a precision that only experience gives, knew hunting techniques and trap placement that doubled their provisions, and had the infinite patience of one who has learned that nature cannot be rushed. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked him one afternoon, while he taught her to repair a rabbit trap with a more efficient mechanism than the one she had always used. Jonah continued with his task, his fingers working with an artisan's precision on the wire and wood. The setting sun drew copper glints from his hair, now cleaner since he had settled on the property. On the road, he finally replied, and before that, in the war. Amelia tensed slightly. The war was a topic rarely mentioned in those lands where many had come to forget or be forgotten. I was a messenger for the Confederate Army, he continued, as if he had decided it was time to drop another stone into the waters until then calm of their coexistence. Not from conviction, but because it was that, or watch my family starve. I was 17 and had fast legs. That's all that mattered. His hands stopped for a moment over the trap, and Amelia noticed how a shadow crossed his face, momentarily darkening the usual clarity of his eyes. My younger brother followed me. Though I tried to prevent it, he paused, and his fingers resumed work, as if the mechanical movement helped him order painful memories. He didn't come back. Amelia didn't respond immediately. She understood the weight of those words, the guilt they implied, the pain that never completely faded. She knew well that type of loss that becomes a constant presence, a ghost that walks beside you. My mother died when I was 12, she finally said, offering her own stone to the shared river of their confidences. It was as if the world lost half its colors. My father was never the same. He took refuge in work and silence, and I learned to do the same. Their gazes met over the nearly finished trap, and in that instant something passed between them, a mutual recognition of wounds that, though different, bled in similar ways. It wasn't pity they shared, but understanding, that rare comprehension, born only between those who have walked parallel paths of loss. That night, sitting on the porch under a sky so full of stars it seemed about to spill over them, they shared a cup of coffee. The silence was no longer a barrier, but a habitable space where both fit without need to pretend or explain. I like the sound of wind in this valley, Jonah commented, his gaze lost in the darkness surrounding the small island of light projected by the oil lamp. It has its own cadence as if it were the earth's breathing. Amelia nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It was something she herself had felt many times, but had never put into words. My father said each valley has its own song, she replied. That's why the ancients chose so carefully where to settle, not just for water or game, but because they needed a place whose song they could understand. Jonah smiled, and Amelia was surprised to notice how infrequent that gesture was in him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines that weather and hardship had carved. Your father was a wise man, he said, and the use of the possessive, that small your instead of the formal her, marked another threshold crossed between them. Amelia didn't correct the change. Instead, she allowed that new intimacy to settle between them, as naturally as dew on grass at dawn. Night had entered its deepest hours. The fire in the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the log walls, creating a warm refuge against the outer darkness. Amelia had invited Jonah to dine inside the cabin for the first time, a decision she had made that same afternoon while watching him repair the chicken coop roof under persistent drizzle. The rustic table her father had built years ago now held the remains of a simple but abundant dinner. Rabbit stewed with herbs beginning to sprout in the small garden, freshly baked bread, and a bottle of whiskey Amelia kept for special occasions, though these rarely arrived. The alcohol had loosened something in both, not to imprudence, but to that exact point where words find paths that sobriety blocks. The flames reflected in Jonah's eyes, while he related stories of his travels, impossible landscapes, encounters with native tribes still resisting civilization's relentless advance, nights under stars so bright they could almost be touched. Amelia listened fascinated, traveling with him through his words. The world he described was vast and wild, so different from the known confines of her valley, and yet she felt no envy or longing to escape. Her roots were firmly planted in this earth she had learned to love through daily effort. Sometimes, I think nomads like me and settlers like you are two sides of the same coin, Jonah reflected, Ed slowly turning his glass in his hands. Both searching for home, only some find it in a place and others on the road itself. Amelia considered his words, feeling they touched something deep within her. And you? She asked, her voice softer than usual. Have you found your home on the road? The question hung between them like a musical note that refuses to fade, Jonah looked toward the fire, and in his profile illuminated by flames, Amelia saw a vulnerability he rarely allowed to show. "I thought I had," he finally replied. "For years I convinced myself that constant movement was enough, that the freedom of not belonging anywhere compensated for loneliness. But lately," he left the sentence unfinished, as if the necessary words hadn't yet been invented. A log split in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks upward. In that brief glow, their gazes met and held longer than prudence advised. Amelia felt a warmth. That didn't come from the fire expanding through her chest. With a deliberate movement, she rose and approached the window, needing to put distance between herself and the moment's intensity. Outside, the moon illuminated the prairie with silver, light that transformed the familiar into something mysterious and new. "Jonah," she began with her back to him, finding it easier to speak this way. "I've never been kissed nor touched. I've kept my whole life intact, as if waiting for something that never came." The words came out like water from a broken dam, surprising her with their raw honesty. The silence that followed weighed so much she could almost feel it on her shoulders. When she finally dared to turn, she found Jonah standing, a few steps away. His eyes so intense she had to resist the impulse to look away. "Then we'll begin slowly," he said, with a tenderness that made something within Amelia tremble. There was no kiss that night. Instead, when they walked together to the door where their paths must separate so he could return to his shelter by the shed, their hands met briefly. Jonah's rough fingers brushed hers, a contact as light as a bird's wing. Beat, but which sent waves of warmth throughout her body. In that simple gesture, in that first bridge built between two solitudes, Amelia felt something being born that she didn't know was possible. Hope. Days began to interweave like threads on a loom, forming a pattern neither had planned, but which seemed to have its own internal logic. Jonah no longer mentioned his departure to Fort Laramie, and Amelia didn't ask. Instead, they had established a routine that adapted to the rhythm of earth and seasons. One morning, Amelia woke to the rhythmic sound of a hammer. Upon going out to the porch, she discovered Jonah working on a structure beside the main cabin, where before there had only been empty space between it and the shed. "What are you building?" she asked, approaching with a cup of coffee she offered as part of their morning ritual. Jonah took the cup, his fingers deliberately brushing hers in a brief but meaningful contact. He had become bolder in these small gestures since that night, of confessions, though always staying within the limits of a respect Amelia appreciated. "A workshop," he replied, pointing to the already raised beams. "For tools, and for working when autumn rains come. It will also serve as storage for the harvest." Amelia observed the nascent structure with critical eyes. It was solid, built to last, not a temporary solution. There was something deeply moving about seeing Jonah invest so much effort in something that, by its very nature, was anchored to this place's future. "It's a good design," she commented, hiding behind practical words the emotion she felt. "My father always wanted to build something like this, but never had time." Jonah nodded, understanding what she didn't say. During these months, he had learned to read in her silences as much as in her words. "Your father left a good foundation," he said, looking toward the main cabin, whose firm foundations and solid walls spoke of a man who built thinking of future generations. "I'm just adding what time didn't allow him to finish." They worked together, that day and the following ones, shoulder to shoulder, passing tools without needing to ask for them, anticipating each other's movements as if they had been doing so for years. For Amelia, who had always valued her independence as a necessity imposed by circumstances, discovering the pleasure of shared work was a revelation. One afternoon, while nailing the last boards of the roof, Jonah spoke to her of his plans: installing gutters to collect rainwater, building terraces on the south slope to protect the earth against erosion, planting fruit trees that would take years to bear fruit, but would someday convert the property into an oasis of abundance. Amelia listened, noting how all these projects extended toward a future where she wasn't alone. A future he visualized with such clarity he could almost touch it. "You speak as if you were going to stay," she finally said, the words escaping before she could contain them. Jonah stopped hammering and looked at her directly. The setting sun drew copper glints from his hair, now longer and domesticated by regular care. "Would it bother you if I did?" he asked, with a vulnerability that contrasted with the physical strength he displayed daily. Amelia held his gaze, feeling they had reached another of those decisive moments that, like stones in a river, alter the water's course. "No," she replied with simplicity. "It wouldn't bother me." Something changed in Jonah's expression, an almost imperceptible loosening of the lines around his eyes, as if a tension he had maintained for a long time finally found relief. That night, sitting on the porch as had become their custom, Amelia gathered courage to ask the question that had been growing within her like a stubborn seed. "Jonah, what do you really want from me?" The stars seemed to hold their breath while waiting for his answer. Jonah contemplated the horizon for a long moment, as if seeking the adequate words in the line where earth merged with the night sky. "I want to build something with someone who doesn't scare easily," he finally said, his voice deep and sure. "Someone who sees beyond what already was." The simplicity of his response, free of flowery romanticisms but full of truth, touched something deep in Amelia. These weren't words of conquest or possession, but of companionship and respect, of a future built stone by stone with 4 hands instead of 2. Under the star-filled immensity, on that porch that had witnessed so many solitudes, Amelia felt something within her finally finding its place, like a puzzle piece that fits perfectly after many failed attempts. The town of Fort Laramie stretched along the main street like a necklace of mismatched beads. Wood cabins, shops with awnings faded by sun and weather, and the 2-story saloon, whose faded sign swayed with each gust of wind, composed the human landscape closest to Amelia's property. It was the first time in 3 months that she and Jonah visited the settlement together. They had arrived in the newly repaired cart, loaded with pelts he had finally decided to sell, and products from the garden that was beginning to yield its first fruits under their shared care. Amelia felt curious gazes following them as they traveled. The main street. For a small community where rumors traveled faster than horses, Jonah's presence on her property hadn't gone unnoticed. Women who before barely greeted her with a distant gesture now watched her with renewed interest, and men studied Jonah with that mixture of caution and respect they reserved for strangers who decided to put down roots. "People talk," she commented, in a low voice while they waited for the shopkeeper to finish weighing the flour they had come to buy. "They always have." Jonah, busy examining a new axe at the counter, gave her a calm look. "Words are carried by the wind," he replied. "Actions remain. Let them talk." There was a security in his posture, a tranquility Amelia envied. Jonah seemed impermeable to others' opinions, as if he had learned long ago that a person's value didn't reside in what others thought of them. Upon leaving the store, they encountered Pastor Wilson, a thin man with a severe face who led the small church on the town's outskirts. His gaze settled first on Amelia and then on Jonah, with a scrutiny that didn't attempt to hide its disapproval. "Miss Cartwright," he greeted with a minimal nod. "It's been a while since we've seen you at Sunday services." Amelia tensed her jaw. The pastor had been one of those who made the least effort to help her after her father's death, limiting himself to offering prayers when what she needed were hands to work the land. "Work doesn't respect Sundays, Pastor," she replied with forced politeness, "especially when one is alone." "You no longer seem to be alone," the man observed, his eyes moving toward Jonah with an implicit question. Before Amelia could respond, Jonah stepped forward and extended his hand with a formality she rarely had seen in him. "Jonah Mercer, sir," he introduced himself. "I work on Miss Cartwright's property." The pastor shook his hand briefly, like one fulfilling a disagreeable obligation. "I hope your arrangement is appropriate in the eyes of God and this community," he said, with a tone that made clear he considered such possibility unlikely. Amelia felt blood rise to her face, a mixture of shame and indignation that threatened to overflow. But before she could say something she might regret, Jonah spoke with a calm that contrasted with the moment's tension. "God sees the heart, Pastor, not appearances," he said, and though his tone was respectful, there was a firmness in his words that admitted no reply. And this community is lucky to count on someone like Miss Cartwright, who keeps alive the land her father worked with such effort. Pastor Wilson seemed momentarily disconcerted by the response. He nodded dryly, and after muttering a hurried blessing, continued on his way, leaving them alone on the wooden sidewalk. "You didn't have to defend me," Amelia said when the man was far enough away. Jonah looked at her with an expression combining tenderness and determination. "I didn't," he replied. "I just told the truth. There's a difference." They continued their purchases in complicit silence, but Amelia noticed something had changed between them. Jonah's public defense had established a different bond, as if he had openly declared they were together in this, whatever this was that they were building. That afternoon, when the sun began its descent and they prepared to return to the property, Jonah surprised her by stopping in front of the town's small jewelry shop, a modest establishment Amelia had rarely had occasion to visit. "Do you mind if we go in for a moment?" he asked. Intrigued, she nodded and followed him inside. The shop was empty except for the owner, an older man with glasses hanging from a chain over his worn vest. Jonah exchanged some words with him in a low voice, and then returned to Amelia with something in his hand. "I saw it months ago before meeting you," he explained, opening his palm to reveal a simple silver pendant in the shape of a maple leaf. "It reminded me of the trees growing by the river, near where we're building the terraces." Amelia contemplated. The piece moved not so much by the object itself, but by the fact that Jonah had related it to a place both now considered theirs. It was a symbol, not of possession, but of shared belonging. "It's beautiful," she said, taking it with slightly trembling fingers. "Like the place we're building," he replied, and in his eyes was a silent question. In response, Amelia turned and lifted her hair, offering him her nape in a gesture of trust that said more than any word. She felt Jonah's fingers, surprisingly gentle for hands so weathered by work, brush her skin while securing the necklace's clasp. When she turned toward him, something had changed in the air between them, a decision taken without need to voice it. "There's a dance this Saturday in town," she said, her voice sounding more confident than she felt. "If you want, we could come." Jonah smiled, one of those rare, full smiles that transformed his face and illuminated his eyes. "I'd like that very much," he replied simply. On the way home, while the cart advanced along the dusty road and the sun painted the horizon in copper and gold tones, Amelia found herself thinking of the word home, not as the place they were returning to, but as the space they had created between the two of them, a portable refuge made of shared glances, joint work, and complicit silences. The Fort Laramie Community Hall glowed with the light of dozens of oil lamps hanging from the low ceiling. The notes of a violin and banjo intertwined in air, heavy with cheap perfumes, sweat, and the collective excitement that only a dance could generate in a community where diversions were as scarce as rain in August. Amelia remained by the entrance, wearing a pale blue dress that had belonged to her mother, and which she had hastily modified for the occasion. The fabric, stored for years in a trunk, retained a faint scent of lavender that brought her fleeting memories of a distant childhood, when her mother still sang while cooking and her father laughed easily. Beside her, Jonah seemed transformed. He had shaved completely, revealing a younger face than usually appeared. His white shirt, the only one he possessed and which he had washed and ironed with care, contrasted with the dark vest they had found in town that same morning, an impulsive purchase that now gave him an air of formal dignity Amelia found strangely moving. "I don't remember the last time I was at a dance," he confessed, leaning slightly toward her to make himself heard above the music and general murmur. "I think it was before the war." Amelia nodded, understanding. There were entire stories contained in those brief words, chapters of life that had been suspended when the conflict divided the country, and so many lives with it. "I haven't come for years either," she replied, her eyes roaming the hall where couples spun to the rhythm of a lively polka. "The few times I came, I stayed seated with the other single women, waiting for an invitation that never came." Jonah followed her gaze, observing the chairs aligned against the wall where now sat various older women, and some young ones waiting their turn with expressions oscillating between hope and resignation. "Tonight will be different," he said, offering his arm with a smile that illuminated his clear eyes. "If you'll grant me the honor." Amelia placed her hand on Jonah's forearm, feeling under the fabric the firm muscle formed by months of hard work. As they advanced toward the dance floor, she noticed the gazes following them, some curious, others surprised, a few openly disapproving. The blacksmith's wife leaned to whisper something in her neighbor's ear, and both watched them with narrowed eyes. For a moment, Amelia felt her old self wanting to shrink, to withdraw from those gazes and return to the safety of her isolation. But then she felt Jonah's hand settle gently on her waist, while the other took hers, and everything else seemed to fade. The music changed to a waltz, and Jonah guided her with surprising grace for a man who spent his days among tools and animals. His steps were sure but gentle, like everything he did, and Amelia found herself following him with a naturalness she never would have expected of herself. "So you dance well for someone who hasn't done it in so long," she commented, allowing herself a smile. "Some things aren't forgotten," he replied, "like riding a horse or—" He paused, and his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that accelerated her pulse, recognizing when something is right. They spun to the music's rhythm, and Amelia felt a strange freedom, as if by moving among the other town inhabitants, by being seen with Jonah, she was finally claiming her place in the world. She was no longer the solitary woman everyone pitied or ignored. She was someone who had chosen and had been chosen in return. When the piece ended, they remained a moment in the dance's posture, their gazes connected in that silent language they had developed. Then, as if they had reached a tacit agreement, Jonah led her toward the hall's back door, which opened to a small patio surrounded by trees where some couples sought respite from the heat and interior bustle. The summer night was perfect, with an almost full moon that silvered the trees' contours and the hall's roof. In the garden's darkness, small yellow flashes flickered among the bushes, fireflies dancing their own immemorial dance. "Look," Jonah whispered, pointing toward the luminous insects. "When I was a child, I believed they were fallen stars seeking their way back to heaven." Amelia smiled at that image. It was one of those rare moments when Jonah offered her a glimpse of his childhood, of the person he had been before life and war carved their scars into him. "My mother said they were souls that didn't want to leave entirely," she replied, the memory surfacing clear and sharp, that they remained close to those they loved, lighting small lights to guide them in darkness. Jonah looked at her with tenderness, and in the night's blue penumbra his face seemed more vulnerable, stripped of the defenses both maintained in daylight. "Do you think they watch us?" he asked in a low voice. "Those who have gone?" Amelia considered the question, feeling its weight. She thought of her father, of how he would have seen this man who now shared her life and land. "If they do," she finally replied, "I hope they see that we're trying to honor them, continuing what they began." Jonah nodded, understanding the layers of meaning in her words. He approached her slowly, as if giving time for her to withdraw if she wished. But Amelia remained still, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. In that garden illuminated by moon and fireflies, far from the town's gazes but feeling the benign presence of those no longer there, Amelia took the step she had been waiting to take. She leaned forward and placed her lips on Jonah's. The kiss was soft, measured, like rain on dry earth. A first contact that promised more but demanded nothing. When they separated, both had the clear and serene gaze of those who have crossed a threshold together, long contemplated. "I think it's time to go home," she said, and the word home now contained a universe of shared meanings. Jonah took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers in a gesture that sealed what had just occurred between them. "Home," he repeated, like a promise. Dawn found Amelia awake, watching how the day's first light drew golden patterns on the cabin's wooden ceiling. Beside her, Jonah slept deeply, his face relaxed in an expression of peace he rarely showed when awake. One of his arms rested over her waist, not as possession, but as an anchor, a point of contact that confirmed what had occurred the night before hadn't been a dream. After the dance, they had returned to the property under a starry sky that seemed to bless each decision taken. Words had been few, unnecessary. Instead, The language of the body had taken over. Hands that unbuttoned buttons with reverence, lips discovering each other's geography, breaths intertwined in the room's complicit darkness. For Amelia, whose body had remained so long like unexplored territory, each of Jonah's caresses had been a discovery. His hands, rough from work but infinitely gentle in their treatment, had guided her through sensations she had never imagined possible. And in that shared journey, she had found a freedom that defied everything she had been taught about female decorum and virtue. Now, contemplating Jonah's profile outlined against the pillow, Amelia felt a deep certainty take root in her. It wasn't just desire that had united them, but a mutual recognition, an affinity that transcended the physical. They were two solitudes that had found in the other an unexpected reflection, an echo that responded to questions long formulated. In silence, Jonah opened his eyes slowly as if he had felt the intensity of her gaze. For an instant he seemed disoriented, but then his eyes found hers and a smile drew on his lips. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice hoarse from sleep. "Good morning," Amelia replied, surprised by the naturalness with which those everyday words acquired new meaning in this transformed context. Jonah raised a hand and gently caressed her cheek, a gesture so simple but charged with an intimacy that weeks ago would have seemed impossible. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, and behind the banal question lurked another deeper one. "Are you okay with all this? With us?" Amelia nodded, covering his hand with hers. "Better than in a long time," she replied with sincerity. They looked at each other in silence, the morning light creating a golden sanctuary around the bed, a sacred space where time seemed suspended. Outside, the familiar sounds of morning began to manifest, the distant clucking of chickens, the whinny of horses in the stable, the wind stirring the old oak's branches beside the cabin. Life continued its course, but something fundamental had changed at the very center of that shared life. Later, while they prepared breakfast together in the kitchen, Amelia noticed how their bodies moved in an instinctive dance, anticipating each other's movements, yielding space, meeting in casual touches that were no longer accidental. It was as if they had created a new language, one made of gestures, glances, and contacts that only they could fully interpret. "I have to finish repairing the west fence today," Jonah commented while serving coffee in 2 chipped cups. "The miller's sheep were wandering nearby yesterday." Amelia nodded, silently grateful they maintained this appearance of normalcy, this routine that anchored their new intimacy in the solidity of daily work. "I'll check the traps and plant the pumpkin seeds we got in town," she replied, cutting slices of bread she had baked the day before. For a moment, the conversation's ordinariness overwhelmed her with its perfect simplicity. Was this how it felt to share a life? This interweaving of tasks and bodies, of futures and pasts that met in the immediate present of shared coffee and plans for the day. "Jonah," she said suddenly, needing to express something of the emotion she felt bubbling inside. "This is—" She stopped, unsure how to continue, how to put into words the transformation she felt, the seismic shift in her existence's foundations. He set down the coffee pot and approached her, taking her face in his hands with a delicacy that contrasted with his physical strength. "I know," he said simply, and Amelia understood no more words were needed. They kissed under the morning light filtering through the kitchen window, a kiss different from the night before's, not of discovery, but of confirmation. In that contact was an implicit promise, a commitment that needed no ceremonies or witnesses to be real and binding. When they separated, Jonah kept his forehead against hers, their breaths mixing in the minimal space between their faces. "I never thought I'd find this," he confessed in a whisper, "a place to stop, someone with whom to want to do it." Amelia closed her eyes, letting his words envelop her like a blanket in winter. She had spent so many years convincing herself that solitude was her inevitable destiny, that the possibility of a shared life had seemed as remote as the stars she observed from her porch on clear nights. "Neither did I," she replied, and in those 2 words was contained a lifetime of resignation, now transformed into hope. That night, Jonah didn't return to the shed that had been his refuge for months. Instead, he moved his few belongings to the main cabin, carefully placing the wooden box containing his most precious memories beside the one Amelia kept under her bed. 2 stories that now began to be written on the same paper, with the same ink, time, which until then had been for Amelia. An enemy that slowly eroded her strength and hopes became an ally. Each dawn brought the promise of another day together, another chapter in the story they were creating with their intertwined hands and united bodies. Summer gave way to autumn, with a gradualness perceived only by those who live in close communion with the earth. The wheat fields turned golden, ready for harvest, and the trees began to dress in copper and orange colors that contrasted with the sky's increasingly pale blue. Jonah worked on constructing a new room adjacent to the main cabin. His expert hands cut and assembled wood with the precision of one who has learned that each piece must fit perfectly to resist time's and season's assaults. Amelia watched him from the garden, where she collected the last tomatoes before nightly. Frosts began to threaten them. The property had flourished under joint care. The stable, once rickety, now looked solid and enlarged. Fences firmly delimited their small kingdom's boundaries. The garden produced more than they could consume, allowing them to trade surplus in town. Every corner showed the seal of a home, inhabited by 2 people who had found in shared work a form of love as valid as any other. While hammering the last board of the window frame, Jonah looked up and met Amelia's gaze. Even at a distance, she could see the smile that illuminated his face, that gesture that still caused her heart to skip each time she witnessed it. "Come see," he called, gesturing with his hand. Amelia left her tomato basket and approached, drying, her hands on her apron. The new room began to take shape. Walls were already raised, and now Jonah worked on windows that would let in eastern light each morning. "What do you think?" he asked, putting an arm around her shoulders when she reached his side. Amelia contemplated the space, still under construction, but already defined in its essential contours. It was smaller than the main room, but cozy, with views toward the stream and hills she so loved. "It's perfect," she replied, leaning slightly against him. "I thought we could finish it before winter arrives," Jonah commented, his eyes surveying the work still to be done. "The snowfalls are more intense each year." Amelia nodded, understanding what he didn't say. This space wasn't just a practical expansion, but a declaration of permanence, a commitment to the future they were building together. "What will we use it for?" she asked, though something inside already whispered an answer she barely dared formulate. Jonah looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and solemnity that made her heart race. "For whatever we need," he replied simply. "To grow." The word floated between them like a seed carried by wind, charged with possibilities. Amelia felt warmth expand from her womb to her cheeks. They hadn't spoken explicitly of children, but in their shared nights they hadn't taken precautions to avoid them. The idea, which at another time would have seemed terrifying in her solitude, now presented itself as a natural continuation of the path they had undertaken together. "I would like that," she finally said, her voice sounding firmer than expected. "To grow with you." Jonah set down the hammer and turned completely toward her, taking her face in his hands with that delicacy that always surprised her in such a strong man. "Amelia Cartwright," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "Would you do me the honor of being my wife? I don't have much to offer you more than these hands, and the promise to use them every day to build a life with you." The proposal, formulated in that half-built space symbolizing their future, touched something deep in Amelia. It wasn't the first time she had thought of marriage. She had had 2 suitors in her youth, both rejected for different reasons. But it was the first time the idea didn't provoke anxiety or a sense of loss, but quiet certainty. "Yes," she replied, with simplicity. "Though we've already been building that life together for some time, don't you think?" Jonah smiled, that full smile there. It transformed his face and temporarily erased the traces pain and difficulties had left on it. "That's true," he conceded, "but I'd like to make it official. For you, for me, and for whoever might come after." They kissed in the middle of that unfinished space, surrounded by the scent of freshly cut wood and damp earth entering through the windowless openings. A kiss that tasted of promises and future, of decisions made, and paths that intertwined like tree roots in the subsoil invisible but fundamental. That night, sitting on the porch as had been their custom from the beginning, they contemplated stars beginning to appear in the autumn sky. The cool air carried the scent of fallen leaves and first frost, announcing a change of season. "We could marry when the new room is finished," Jonah suggested, his fingers intertwined with hers. "Before winter makes travel impossible, we could ask the justice of the peace to come here." Amelia nodded, imagining a simple ceremony on this porch that had witnessed so many crucial moments between them. She didn't need the white dress or crowded church some town girls dreamed of. Their union already existed in what was fundamental. This would simply be giving it a name others could recognize. "I'd like to plant a tree that day," she said, the idea forming as she spoke. "An oak or maple, something that will grow with us." Through the coming years, Jonah smiled, understanding the gesture's symbolic beauty. "A tree to mark a beginning," he nodded. "It seems perfect to me." They remained silent a while longer, letting night envelop them. The oil lamp projected a warm circle of light around them, creating an intimate refuge against growing darkness. In the distance, a coyote's solitary howl reminded them the wild world was still there, vast and indifferent, but no longer seemed threatening as before. "Do you ever regret it?" Amelia suddenly asked. "Having stopped here, having given up the zoo?" "Road?" Jonah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, his gaze losing itself in the darkened horizon where mountains merged with the night sky. "The road doesn't disappear," he finally replied. "It just changes form. Before I walked to get away from what hurt. Now I walk towards something, with you. It's a different journey, but still a journey." His words resonated in Amelia like a truth she herself had intuited, but hadn't known how to express. Both were still moving, but together, building something that would last beyond themselves. "I think I'm pregnant," she then said, words escaping like water from a finely broken dam. "I'm not certain, but my body feels different, as if it harbored a secret." Jonah remained motionless for an instant, processing the news. Then, with a deliberately slow movement, he knelt before her and rested his forehead against Amelia's still, flat belly. "Hello," he whispered, and that simple word contained such reverence that Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "We're waiting for you." On that porch, under Wyoming's infinite sky, two lives that had believed themselves destined for solitude celebrated the miracle of continuity, the promise of a future extending beyond themselves like ripples in a pond. Winter arrived with a fury the town elders described as the worst in 30 years. Snow fell incessantly for days, accumulating in drifts reaching the windows and converting the outer world into a ghostly landscape of whites and greys. Wind howled around the cabin like a hungry beast, seeking any crack through which to slip. But inside, in the warm space defined by wooden walls and the fireplace's constant fire, Amelia and Jonah had created their own universe that defied exterior hostility. The new room, finished just before the first snowfalls, now housed a pine cradle Jonah had carved during winter's long nights. Above it, a mobile made from feathers and small animal carvings spun gently with warm air currents. Amelia's pregnancy progressed with the same certainty with which seasons succeeded each other. Her body, once thin and angular from years of hard work, now showed new curves. A roundness Jonah contemplated with a mixture of wonder and reverence. His hands, rough from work but infinitely gentle with her, traced each night the contour of that growing belly, like mapping sacred territory. They had married in November in a simple ceremony officiated by the Justice of Peace, who had agreed to travel from town. There were no guests beyond necessary witnesses. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the town mercery and had been kind to Amelia when others avoided her, and old Sam, who had known her father and treated her with the respect owed to the land and those who work it. As planned, they planted a young oak near the porch, its roots wrapped in burlap to protect them until spring, when they could finally sink into the earth. Now, while January spread its ice mantle over the prairie, Amelia found herself in that state of active waiting characterizing pregnancy's final months. Her movements had become slower, more deliberate, but she hadn't stopped working. She adapted her tasks to her new condition, knitting by the fire, preparing preserves with vegetables they had stored in the cellar, curing hides with techniques Jonah had taught her. One particularly cold morning, while snow beat against the windows with renewed fury, Amelia felt the first pains. She said nothing immediately. She observed them like one studying a natural phenomenon, measuring intervals, intensity, mentally preparing for what would come. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded surprisingly calm. "Jonah," she said, interrupting the comfortable silence in which he carved a small wooden horse by the fire, "I think it's time." He looked up, and understanding illuminated his eyes almost instantly. With precise movements, he set aside his work and stood. There was no panic or unnecessary words. In previous weeks they had talked about this moment, had prepared everything necessary, knowing weather might prevent the midwife's arrival from town. Jonah stoked the fire, put water to boil, and prepared the room according to instructions Mrs. Peterson had given them. Then he returned to Amelia, who had reclined on the bed and breathed deeply between contractions. "I'm here," he said simply, taking her hand. "We're together in this." Hours slipped by like rosary beads, each contraction marking time's passage, with greater intensity than any clock. Outside, the storm raged, isolating them even more from the outer world, as if nature itself wanted to ensure this moment belonged exclusively to them. Amelia, who had faced so many difficulties in solitude, discovered new strength in Jonah's constant presence. It wasn't just his practical help, cold compresses on her forehead, water he offered between contractions, words of encouragement whispered, but the absolute certainty of not being alone at the threshold of this new territory. When the culminating moment finally arrived, their eyes met in an instant of perfect clarity, as if both found themselves in a hurricane's eye where everything was stillness and understanding. "I can see him," Jonah said, his voice broken by emotion. "He's coming, Amelia, a little more." With a final effort that seemed to gather all her vital forces, Amelia gave birth to her son, while the storm reached its peak outside, as if the entire universe participated in this act of creation. The baby's cry, strong and clear, rose above the wind's howl, a new sound that transformed the cabin forever. Jonah held him with trembling hands, wrapping him in the blankets they had prepared, before placing him on Amelia's chest. "It's a boy," he said, and on his face, weathered by the elements, tears traced bright furrows. "A perfect boy." Amelia looked at her son for the first time, that small being of wrinkled skin and dark hair, and felt something within her expand until it almost hurt. It was a love different from anything she had experienced before, primitive and overwhelming, in its intensity. "Ethan," she whispered, remembering the name they had chosen if it were a boy, in honor of Jonah's lost brother. "Welcome, Ethan." Jonah sat beside them, forming a protective circle with his body. Outside, the storm began to subside, as if having fulfilled its role in this drama of life, it now withdrew discreetly. "He has your eyes," Amelia observed, noticing how the baby briefly opened his eyelids, revealing a glimpse of that clear blue so characteristic of Jonah. "And your stubborn chin," he replied with a smile, touching with one finger the newborn's chin, where indeed a determination reminiscent of his mother's could be divined. That night, while Ethan slept in his newly inaugurated cradle, Amelia and Jonah remained awake, too moved by the wonder of what had occurred to surrender to sleep. Through the window they could see the storm had completely ceased. The moon, almost full, peaked between scattered clouds, projecting silver radiance over the immaculate snow mantle covering their property. "It's as if the world had been created anew," Jonah murmured, contemplating the transformed landscape. Amelia nodded, understanding perfectly what he meant. Ethan's birth had redrawn their existence's contours, had granted new meanings to every aspect of their lives. The cabin, which had once been for her a solitary refuge against a hostile world, had now become the center of a universe full of promises and possibilities. "Do you ruse?" Its branches extending enough to offer partial shade over the porch during the day's hottest hours. Amelia contemplated it, marveling at how something that had begun so fragile now showed such strength and determination. "Mom, look!" Ethan's enthusiastic voice interrupted her reflections. The boy ran toward her, holding something in his cupped hands. "I found a treasure." Amelia set her cup aside and leaned to receive her son, who stopped before her with breath quickened from running and eyes bright with excitement. Carefully, he opened his hands to reveal his find, a small quartz stone that sparkled with all rainbow colors when light touched it at the right angle. "It's precious, Ethan," she said, taking the stone to examine it better. "A true treasure." "Dad says it's special because I found it myself," the boy explained, his expression solemn, contrasting with the dirt staining his cheeks. "Can we keep it with the other important things?" Amelia nodded, understanding perfectly. The wooden box they had begun for Ethan now contained an eclectic collection of memories. The amber stone Jonah had found years ago, feathers from different birds meticulously identified, stream snail shells, the first tooth he had lost, the wooden bead bracelet Jonah had carved for his 3rd birthday. "Of course," she replied, storing the stone in her apron pocket. "We'll put it there tonight and tell Sarah the story of how you found it, so she'll know it too when she's older." Ethan smiled, satisfied, and then his attention turned to the basket, where his sister was beginning to stir, awakening from her nap. "Can I show her my stone now?" he asked, approaching with that mixture of curiosity and care he always showed toward the baby. "Certainly," Amelia replied, helping him sit beside her and adjusting the basket's position so he could see his sister better. "Just remember to be gentle, as we taught you." Jonah joined them, wiping his hands on a cloth before sitting on Ethan's other side. His face, bronzed by outdoor work, showed more defined expression lines around eyes and mouth, marks of a life fully lived, with all its joys and worries. "Our explorer found a new treasure, I see," he commented, winking at Amelia over their son's head. "A very special one," she confirmed, returning his smile. They remained thus, the 4 together on the porch, while the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky with golden and reddish tones, reflected in the cabin's windows. Sarah woke completely and began waving her little fists in the air, provoking laughter from her brother as he caught her finger with surprising strength. "Sometimes," Jonah said in a low voice, his gaze roaming the property they had transformed together, "I wonder if your father can see us, if he knows his land lives on, that it has borne fruit beyond what he could have imagined." Amelia followed his gaze, feeling a wave of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. She thought of her father, of his silent determination, of how he had maintained this land despite all difficulties, unknowingly preparing the stage for the life she now lived. "I think he knows," she replied, and her voice sounded firm despite the emotion she felt growing in her chest. "Somehow, I think he's part of all this. He planted the first seeds, literally and figuratively." Jonah nodded, understanding. He leaned over Ethan to take Amelia's hand, that simple gesture that continued being their shared anchor in moments of greatest significance. "And we keep cultivating what he began," he added. "Not just the land, but also values, memories, new lives." Ethan, absorbed in his interaction with his sister, seemed oblivious to his parents' conversation, but Amelia knew these words, these moments, were forming the invisible foundations on which her son would build his own life. Just as her father had done for her, just as Jonah and she now did for their children. When twilight gave way to the first star, the family returned to the cabin's interior, carrying with them the day's warmth and the promise of shared night. While Jonah lit the lamp and Amelia began dinner preparations, with Ethan faithfully following to help, and Sarah observing everything from her small kitchen cradle, the circle seemed to complete itself. From solitude to encounter, from fear to trust, from survival to fullness. The life flowing within those wooden walls was testimony that even in the most remote places, even after the deepest losses, the human capacity to rebuild, to connect, to love, remained unbreakable. Later that night, when the children slept and the house sank into late hours welcoming silence, Amelia and Jonah returned to the porch, faithful to their ritual. The clear sky revealed a universe of stars that seemed to observe them with benevolence. "I never imagined it would be possible to feel such peace," Amelia murmured, leaning against Jonah's shoulder while they contemplated the valley submerged in darkness, barely outlined by the moon's silver light. "Do you remember that night?" 5. "Years ago when you asked if I was happy I had stayed," he replied, his voice a warm rumble in the night's stillness. Amelia nodded, smiling at the memory. "You answered every day," she said. "And I've asked you many times since then." "And my answer remains the same," Jonah affirmed, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Every day I'm more certain I made the right decision that day, when I saw your chimney smoke in the distance." An owl hooted somewhere nearby, its call resonating in the night like an ancestral blessing. The familiar sound reminded them they were part of something greater than themselves, an eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth that nature executed with immemorial precision. "Sometimes I think about who I was before you arrived," Amelia reflected. "That solitary woman, so rigid and fearful under her layer of hardness. I barely recognize her now." "I see her," Jonah said with tenderness. "I see her in your strength, in how you protect our children, in your determination when we face difficulties. She hasn't disappeared, Amelia. She has only flourished." The metaphor moved her deeply. It was true. She hadn't abandoned that woman she once was, with her pain and fears. She had simply added new layers to her existence, like a tree that grows ring by ring, incorporating each lived season without losing its essence. "And you," she replied, turning to look at him directly. "The man who carried his possessions on a horse, always ready to leave at the next dawn. He's also still here, in your way of looking at the horizon, in how you teach Ethan to read the sky and stars, in your stories of distant places." Jonah smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. His nomadic past hadn't been erased by his choice to stay. It had transformed into a different way of exploring, of discovering wonders in the everyday, in their children's daily growth, in the season's subtle changes in their piece of land. A comfortable silence settled between them, that type of silence only possible between two people who have learned to inhabit together space and time, who don't need to fill every moment with words because the other's presence is sufficient communication. From the children's room, through the handmade monitor, came the soft sound of Sarah moving in her cradle, followed by Ethan's drowsy murmur talking to his sister. Unintelligible, words but full of affection. The natural continuation of the bond Amelia and Jonah had begun years ago. "Life is strange," Jonah commented after a while. "I spent years fleeing from anything resembling home, convinced that rootedness was a form of prison. And now I can't imagine greater freedom than this, waking each day knowing exactly where I belong and with whom." Amelia rested her head on his shoulder, breathing the familiar scent of earth wood and that indefinable something that was purely Jonah. In all these years, that smell continued provoking the same sensation of security and belonging she had experienced the first time she had dared get so close to him. Maybe that's true freedom, she reflected. Not the absence of bonds, but consciously choosing those that make us stronger, more complete. The moon slowly ascended the night sky, bathing the porch in silver light that softened contours and created a space outside time, a moment suspended between past and future. In that light, both their faces showed time's shared marks, expression lines around eyes and mouth, small scars from work and minor accidents, the changed texture of skin exposed for years to Wyoming's sun and wind. But these marks didn't speak of deterioration, but of life fully lived, of shared laughter and mutually dried tears, of vigil nights beside sick children and celebration days for abundant harvests. They were visible maps of a journey undertaken together, with all its storms and sunny days. "Tomorrow we have to plant the corn seeds," Jonah commented, returning to life's practicalities that continued their inexorable course. "Ethan wants to help with his own row this year." Amelia smiled, imagining her son with his small shovel, imitating his father's precise movements, learning not just to plant but to be patient, to trust in earth and time. "We'll give him his own piece of garden," she decided, "so he learns that what he sows is his responsibility, successes and failures." Jonah nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "Remember the day you arrived?" she asked, resting her head on Jonah's shoulder. "I aimed the rifle at you." Jonah smiled, embracing her with one arm. "I remember it perfectly. I thought you were the bravest woman I had ever seen, or the most reckless. And now?" she asked, her voice soft in the room's penumbra. "Now I know you were both things," he replied, "and much more." In the hand-carved cradle, Ethan sighed in dreams, a tiny sound that filled the room with its presence. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with distrust and solitude, and now flourished into a family, into roots sinking deeply into Wyoming's earth. "You were right, you know," Jonah commented after a long silence. "That day, when we talked about valley songs, this place has its own melody. Now I can hear it clearly." Amelia closed her eyes, letting sounds envelop her. Her son's measured breathing, the fires crackling in the fireplace, the gentle wind now caressing the cabin like a blessing, and beneath it all, the constant beat of their hearts united by daily choices, by shared work, by a love built stone by stone like the cabin that sheltered them. "I hear it too," she replied simply. Time advanced with seasons' inexorability. Spring succeeded winter, bringing new sprouts and Earth's awakening. The small oak they had planted on their wedding day began to unfold tender leaves, its roots sinking ever deeper into the fertile soil beside the porch. Ethan grew with the same determination as the young tree. At 6 months, he already sat by, himself, observing the world with the intensity inherited from his parents. His eyes, which had retained Jonah's clear blue, followed both their movements with insatiable curiosity. His laughter, when he discovered how to produce it, filled the cabin with joy that seemed impossible to contain within wooden walls. The third autumn together arrived with an abundance that spoke of constant work and well-tended earth. The granaries overflowed with hay for livestock that now included not only the stubborn mule and horses, but also a small flock of sheep and 2 dairy cows. The garden had doubled in size, and the fruit trees Jonah had planted in his first year with her began to yield their first fruits, small but promising. One golden October afternoon, while Amelia collected the last apples from the orchard's only mature apple tree, with Ethan crawling on a blanket spread on the grass, she saw Jonah returning from checking traps. He walked with that firm and constant step she had learned to recognize even at a distance, but there was something new in his posture, a lightness that awakened her curiosity. "You look happy," she commented when he joined them, crouching first. To lift Ethan, who babbled with joy at seeing his father. Jonah smiled, that full smile that still had the power to accelerate Amelia's heart even after 3 years together. "I found something on the way back," he said, sitting on the blanket and placing Ethan on his knees, near the stream, where the Pattersons' land begins. From his pocket he extracted a small object that gleamed in the setting sun's light. When he placed it in Amelia's palm, she saw it was a stone polished by water, with amber veins that seemed to capture and reflect light extraordinarily. "It's beautiful," she said, turning it between her fingers. "It reminded me of your eyes when you—" "Laugh," Jonah explained, with that direct simplicity that made his compliments even more moving. "That same color, like honey against light." Amelia closed her hand around the stone, feeling its solidity and warmth, accumulated during hours under autumn sun. It was a gift so characteristic of Jonah, nothing ostentatious, nothing purchased, but something found in nature and charged with personal meaning. "I'll keep it with Ethan's things," she decided, "for when he's older and wants to know the story of how our family was formed." Jonah nodded, understanding. They had begun collecting small significant objects for their son. The maple leaf pendant Jonah had given her on their first visit to town together, a lock of Ethan's hair at birth, wrapped in a piece of fabric from the dress Amelia had worn. At their wedding, the first feather they had found in the nest built by sparrows under the barn's eave the previous spring. Small treasures that told their intertwined lives' story better than any written words. Ethan, as if perceiving the moment's importance, stretched his little hand toward the stone. Amelia opened hers and let him touch it, watching that he didn't. "Carry it to his mouth as he did with everything he reached lately." "Someday," Jonah said, observing his son explore the stone's smooth texture, "we'll teach him to find his own treasures, to see beauty where others see only common stones." Amelia nodded, moved by the image of a future Ethan running along the stream's banks, discovering the world with the same curiosity and wonder she saw in Jonah's eyes when he contemplated a particularly beautiful dawn or a hawk's flight against the infinite sky. "We'll teach him that the most valuable things are rarely those that shine most," she added, "but those that endure." As if to underscore her words, a gust of wind stirred the apple tree's branches above them, releasing a rain of golden and red leaves that danced in the air before settling gently on the blanket and around them. Ethan laughed, trying to catch leaves with his chubby little hands. That night, after putting Ethan to bed in the cradle that would soon need to be replaced by a small bed, Amelia and Jonah sat on the porch as they had done from the beginning. The ritual remained, though now it included a homemade baby monitor Jonah had built, a system of tubes carrying sound from Ethan's room to the porch, allowing them to hear if he woke. October's sky shone with a clarity brought only by autumn's first cold nights. Stars seemed so close they could almost be touched, and the Milky Way stretched like a silver river across the celestial vault. "Sometimes I think about that first day," Amelia commented, her voice soft in the night stillness. "How everything could have been different if you hadn't seen the chimney smoke or if I had decided to shoot instead of listen." Jonah took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I think some people are destined to find each other," he replied. "If it hadn't been that day, it would have been another. If not here, it would have been elsewhere." Amelia considered his words, feeling their weight and truth. There was something comforting in the idea that, among all the infinite possibilities the world offered, they had managed to find and recognize each other. "Are you still happy you stayed?" she asked, repeating the question she had asked him years ago, when their relationship was just beginning to flourish. Jonah turned toward her, and in the moon's silver light, his face showed all the lines and marks life had inscribed on it, some new like laugh wrinkles around his eyes and others old, like the faint scar on his chin. It was a face Amelia knew better than her own, a map she had learned to read in all seasons and moods. "Every day," he replied, the same words he had used then, but now charged with the weight and wisdom of shared years. "Every day I'm more certain. This is exactly where I should be." He leaned and kissed her softly, a kiss that tasted of freshly picked apples and the promise of the fire they would soon light in the fireplace to combat the night's growing cold. In that moment, while stars slowly turned over the valley they had made theirs, Amelia understood with perfect clarity that happiness wasn't a destination to reach, but a path traveled step by step, day by day, alongside those we choose and who choose us in return. Spring had returned to Wyoming, bringing with it the renewed miracle of rebirth. The fields had dressed again in green, dotted here and there by color explosions, where wildflowers found space to bloom. The stream, fed by mountain snowmelt, ran vigorous and singing, its music a constant in the background of their days. 5 years had passed since that first encounter on the cabin porch. 5 complete cycles of planting and harvest, of winters, huddled by the fire and summers of ceaseless work under the sun. The property, which once had been barely a solitary cabin resisting against the elements, now extended like a small self-sufficient universe. The expanded barn, well-maintained stables, cultivated fields producing more than they needed, allowing them to trade surplus. Amelia, sitting on the porch with a coffee cup in her hands, watched Jonah and Ethan work in the garden. At 4 years old, Ethan insisted on participating in all tasks, imitating his father's movements with a concentration that brought smiles to both. His dark curls, inherited from Amelia, shone under the spring sun, and his crystalline laughter occasionally rose when he discovered a worm or beetle among the freshly turned earth. Beside her, in a wicker basket lined with soft blankets, slept the latest addition to their family, Sarah, barely 3 months old, named in honor of Amelia's mother. The girl had her father and brother's clear eyes, but the reddish hair that, according to Mrs. Peterson, had characterized generations of women in Amelia's family before her. The small oak they had planted on their wedding day now rose firm and vigo,